Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're settling in for a very long, very meandering journey through some of the oddest, most eyebrow-raising jobs that people actually had in the ancient world. So, dim the lights, sink into your pillow, maybe wrap yourself in a blanket that makes you feel like a burrito. Because for the next while, we'll be floating through history's weird workplace resume. And let me tell you, it's a resume no career counselor would ever recommend. People always assume that life in the past was all farming, fighting wars, and maybe the occasional plague. And yes, that was definitely a large percentage of it. But civilizations also produced a strange cast of professional specialists who filled niches that most of us would politely decline. Because, as it turns out, when society gets complex, it always creates some very questionable job listings. So let's start strolling, very slowly, into the bizarre job market of the past. And let's begin with one of the most glamorous of all careers. The Roman public toilet attendant. Picture ancient Rome. Marble columns, senators in togas, maybe Julius Caesar strolling dramatically toward his doom. And now picture a communal public bathroom. Long stone benches with keyhole-shaped cutouts, side by side, no walls, no privacy. Just you, your neighbor, and a whole lot of digestive honesty. Now, after you're finished doing your business, you might ask, how did they handle toilet paper? The answer is they didn't. Instead, the Romans used something called a tersorium, which, if you want the simple description, was basically a communal sponge on a stick. That's right, shared toilet sponges. Because why not, Rome? Here's where the job comes in. Someone had to maintain these sponges, rinse them in a bucket of salt water or vinegar, and hand them out to the next guy waiting his turn. And yes, that person was the public toilet attendant. Imagine waking up every morning knowing you're about to spend your day being the human resources department for Rome's collective bowels. It was not glamorous. It was not respected, but it was steady work. And in a city with 1 million residents, there was never a shortage of demand. The professional mourner of Egypt. Now let's float away from Rome and drift down the Nile. Ancient Egypt had many fascinating occupations. Scribes, priests, pyramid builders, embalmers. But one that always stands out is the professional mourner. Whenever someone important died, the funeral was supposed to be a huge public spectacle. And because no one wanted the vibe of a lukewarm send-off, families could hire women to come to the funeral, throw themselves dramatically on the ground, scream, wail, and tear at their hair. Basically, paid sadness performers. Some were even assigned to take on the roles of goddesses like Isis and Nephthys, so their fake grief carried divine weight. It was theater, religion, and customer service all rolled into one. It may sound strange, but the logic makes sense. Funerals are social events, and just like today's wedding planners or event hosts, Egyptians needed people to make sure things ran smoothly. Only in this case, running smoothly meant making sure the crying was loud enough to impress the neighbors. The leech collector of medieval Europe. Let's wander a little later in time now. Medieval Europe, the land of castles, mud, and way too much bread. Medicine in those days was, let's call it, experimental. And one of the most popular medical treatments was bloodletting with leeches. Doctors loved prescribing leeches for everything. Headaches, fevers, gout, even just being a little too cheerful. The idea was simple. If your humors were out of balance, you needed some blood removed. And leeches were the handy biological vacuum cleaners of the day. But someone had to go get them. That job fell to the leech collector. And the process was not exactly fun. Collectors waded into stagnant ponds and let the slimy creatures attach themselves to their legs. Then they'd peel them off, toss them in a jar, and repeat. The downside was, leeches carry diseases, and the collectors often got sick, bled excessively, or just ended up looking like a human buffet. Still, leech collectors could make decent money, which just proves the timeless truth. People will put up with almost anything if there's cash involved. The Roman vomitorium helper. Probably not what you think. Okay, now this one always gets misinterpreted. People often imagine that Romans had special rooms called vomitoria, where diners went to puke between courses. And yes, that's hilarious, but unfortunately not true. The word vomitorium actually meant the passageways in amphitheaters where crowds spewed out. That said, Romans did have banquet helpers whose job was disturbingly close. These were servants who stood by during lavish feasts and helped guests purge if they overindulged. Because if you're eating peacock tongues and stuffed dormice, sometimes you need a helping hand, so yes. There were attendants armed with feathers or remedies to encourage vomiting, so you could make room for round 2 of the buffet. Imagine explaining that on a resume. Specialized in luxury stomach management for Rome's elite. the gong farmer of Tudor England sliding. Forward again in time, let's stop in Tudor England. This is the era of Henry VIII, Shakespeare, and plague rats, so you know it's going to be messy. Cities didn't have modern plumbing, but they did have public latrines and private cesspits under houses. Over time, those pits filled up, and when they did, you needed to hire a gong farmer. Their job? Climb down into the cesspit with a bucket and shovel out decades of compacted human waste, usually by candlelight, with very limited air. Some suffocated from the fumes, others fell into the muck and didn't come back up. It was not exactly a high-safety occupation, but, like many dirty jobs, it was surprisingly well paid. Gong farmers earned enough to live comfortably, as long as they didn't mind being social outcasts who smelled like a latrine. It's a good reminder that history's economy often rewarded the people willing to do the things everyone else avoided. The keeper of the king's stool, and since we're already knee-deep in toilet humor, let's finish part 1 with one more legendary position, the groom of the stool. This was a genuine job in the courts of Tudor and Stuart England. The groom was responsible for attending the monarch's most private moments, bathroom time. They managed the chamber pot, kept the linens clean, and made sure the king's digestion was in good order. Now, you might think this would be humiliating, but here's the twist. It was actually a highly prestigious role, because when you're the one person allowed in the royal privy, you also get unlimited private access to the king, which meant influence, favors, and sometimes even political power. So yes, entire careers were built on being the medieval world's most exclusive bathroom buddy. Welcome back. Hopefully you're tucked in by now, maybe sipping some lukewarm tea, and wondering why humans have always invented such questionable occupations. Because really, once you've already got a sponge stick attendant and a groom of the royal stool, the bar for workplace dignity is pretty low, so let's wander deeper into the corridors of ancient and medieval job markets. Jobs that ranged from mildly unpleasant to, honestly, how was this ever legal? And of course, all of it conducted with complete seriousness by people who probably didn't think twice about it. The whipping boy of royalty, one of the strangest jobs, or maybe punishments disguised as employment, was the royal whipping boy. The setup went like this. Royal children, especially princes, couldn't be punished by their teachers. After all, you can't just spank the future king. That would be treasonous. So instead, a noble boy of the same age was appointed to be educated alongside the prince. And whenever the young royal misbehaved, the other boy got whipped. The logic was that seeing his friends suffer would make the prince feel guilty and straighten up, which sounds good on paper, but I think we all know how spoiled royal brats usually behaved. Guilt wasn't always their strongest trait. Still, the position had perks. Whipping boys often grew up as close companions to the prince, and some later used those friendships to climb into positions of real power. So yes, you got beaten for someone else's bad handwriting, but you might also end up in the royal inner circle. Mixed bag. The knocker-up of industrial Britain, jumping forward in time to the 18th and 19th centuries. Britain's factories had strict schedules. Alarm clocks weren't common, and punctuality was non-negotiable. Enter the knocker-up. This was a person whose entire job was to go around the streets in the early morning and wake people up. They used long poles, sticks, or even pea shooters to tap on windows until the sleepy workers stirred. Imagine the awkwardness. You're half asleep, drooling on your pillow, and outside your window is a stranger poking your glass with a stick until you drag yourself out of bed. Some workers even had subscriptions, paying a few pennies a week for reliable wake-up service. Of course, knocker-ups weren't exactly respected professionals. They were usually older women, men too old for factory labor, or people desperate for side income. But for decades, before alarm clocks became affordable, they were essential to keeping the Industrial Revolution running on time. The powder tester of royal courts back in the Renaissance and Baroque courts of Europe, poison paranoia was very real. Nobles were constantly convinced that their enemies wanted to spike their wine, bread, or even their face powder. And yes, powdered cosmetics sometimes contained arsenic. So naturally, wealthy aristocrats employed food and powder testers. Their job was straightforward. Taste or sniff everything before the noble did, and wait a while to see if they keeled over. It was an honor, in a very short-lived kind of way. Some testers did die from the role, though most likely it was more psychological stress than actual poison. But the risk was always there. Imagine sitting down to dinner every night, knowing your boss just asked you to test the soup for potential assassination attempts. Bon appetit, the funeral clown of ancient Rome. Now, this one deserves its own moment. Romans loved theatrics, and funerals were no exception. Among the long list of attendants was the funeral clown. This person's job was to dress up as the dead man, wearing a wax mask that looked like him, and then parade around making jokes, dancing and sometimes mocking the deceased's behavior. It was meant to lighten the mood and celebrate life, though one suspects it was also just a little bit awkward. The Romans didn't see death as purely somber. Funerals were public spectacles, and the clown served as both comic relief and symbolic continuation of the dead man's personality. Of course, if your late uncle was an unpleasant man, his clown might spend the whole funeral staggering around pretending to yell at imaginary servants. Which sounds comforting, maybe? The ostrich feather fan-bearer of pharaohs back in ancient Egypt. The pharaohs had many attendants, priests, scribes, generals, and then the fan-bearer. This was exactly what it sounds like. A servant who stood beside the ruler all day holding enormous ostrich feather fans. Their job was to keep the air moving, keep flies away, and generally remind everyone that the pharaoh was too divine to sweat like a mortal. Surprisingly, this wasn't always a lowly position. Some fan-bearers were actually high-ranking officials, combining ceremonial feather-waving with serious administrative duties. It was both a status symbol and a practical way to make sure your ruler didn't melt in the desert sun. So yes, one of the most powerful monarchies on Earth still relied on the equivalent of a human air conditioning unit. The Sin Eater of Britain. Heading back to Britain now, let's talk about the Sin Eater. This was a folk tradition found mostly in rural Wales and England. When someone died, their family could hire a poor man to come to the wake. A loaf of bread and a cup of ale would be placed on the corpse, and the Sin Eater would consume it. The belief was that he absorbed the dead person's sins, freeing their soul for heaven. It was both a ritual and a social scapegoating. Sin Eaters became outcasts, seen as spiritually polluted by the sins they consumed. People avoided them in life, even as they relied on them in death. The job lingered on into the 19th century in some places, but it was never glamorous. Imagine being the designated human garbage disposal for other people's spiritual baggage. Not exactly LinkedIn material, the night soil men of Edo, Japan. Let's leave Europe for a moment and drift over to Japan during the Edo period. Cities like Edo, modern Tokyo, were enormous, with hundreds of thousands of residents, and all of those people, of course, produced waste. Enter the night soil men. Their job was to collect human waste from households at night, haul it away, and sell it as fertilizer to farmers. Unlike in Europe, where cesspit cleaning was seen as disgusting and lowly, in Japan this was actually considered a respectable and even profitable trade. Waste was valuable because it kept agriculture running. So while European gong farmers were treated like untouchables, Japanese night soil collectors could make good money and live with some dignity. Which just proves how much culture shapes what counts as a bad job. The corpse watcher. Finally, let's drift back into Europe one last time tonight and visit the tradition of the corpse watcher. In many cultures, it was considered dangerous to leave a body alone before burial. There were fears of spirits, demons, or even the possibility that the person wasn't actually dead. So families hired watchers. People who would sit beside the corpse through the night, reciting prayers, keeping candles lit, and generally making sure nothing supernatural or inconvenient happened. The work was quiet, eerie, and probably very boring. Imagine spending 12 hours in a dimly lit room, next to a silent body, just waiting for, well, hopefully nothing. It was a necessary job, but one guaranteed to make you question your life choices. And that's where we'll pause for part 2. We've added whipping boys, funeral clowns, and sin eaters to our growing historical resume. The ancient world had sponge stick cleaners, the medieval world had leech collectors, and the early modern world had human alarm clocks. Next time, we'll keep gliding through the centuries, unearthing even more odd occupations, from animal trainers with truly dangerous clients, to court jesters who weren't as funny as you'd think. Alright, so far we've traveled through sponge stick duty in Rome, royal whipping boys, and even sin eaters chewing on bread at funerals. By now, you're probably realizing that history's job market was a combination of desperation, superstition, and, let's call it, creative human resources. So let's keep floating. Tonight, we'll add a few more questionable careers to our imaginary resume. Some are sad, some are bizarre, and some are just proof that human beings will pay for almost anything if it makes them feel more comfortable. The beadle of medieval towns in medieval Europe. Many towns employed a beadle. The job description was vague. On paper, beadles were supposed to keep order, act as a sort of minor constable, and assist the church with disciplinary matters. In practice, they were part policeman, part errand boy, and part town gossip. Beadles carried sticks, not to fight crime, but mostly to poke at drunks, herd beggars, or shoo people out of church when they were snoring too loudly. Some had authority to publicly shame petty criminals by dragging them to the stocks. Others were more like glorified hall monitors with medieval job security. Not exactly glamorous, but if you liked power without responsibility, being a beadle was probably your dream career. Charles Dickens even made fun of them centuries later, which tells you they were never particularly respected. The court dwarf moving into royal households again. Let's talk about court dwarfs. From ancient Egypt to Renaissance Europe, rulers often kept individuals with dwarfism as entertainers, companions, or symbols of exotic prestige. In Spain, under the Habsburgs, court dwarfs were considered part of the royal household, often painted into grand portraits right beside kings and queens. In some cases they had real status, but more often, they were treated like living curiosities, tolerated, pampered, and occasionally humiliated. It's not exactly a career people chose for themselves, but it was one of those roles that existed in the strange world of court life. If you happened to be born with dwarfism and caught the eye of a royal patron, your life could swing between luxury and exploitation. Not the strangest job by duties, but by the sheer weirdness of how courts viewed people as decorative staff. The dog whipper, yes, this one is real. In English parish churches during the 16th to 19th centuries, there was an official called the dog whipper. Their job was to patrol the church during services and remove dogs that wandered in. Apparently, dogs loved slipping into churches. Maybe for warmth, or maybe just because their owners brought them. And while the congregation tried to focus on sermons, a dog might be barking, fighting, or chasing someone's hat. The dog whipper carried a stick to gently, or not so gently, escort the animals outside. Some even had whips or tongs for grabbing stubborn hounds. It was a humble but necessary position in the age before leash laws, and honestly, if you've ever been to a service where someone's phone kept ringing, you can imagine exactly how annoyed parishioners were at a pack of dogs interrupting communion. The alchemist's assistant back. In the days when alchemy was considered science, or at least the slightly drunk uncle of science, alchemists employed assistants. These poor souls were tasked with stirring mysterious brews, grinding endless powders, and occasionally breathing in toxic mercury fumes. While the master alchemist dreamt of turning lead into gold, or discovering the elixir of immortality, the assistant usually just developed chronic coughs and stained hands. Sometimes they doubled as scapegoats when experiments exploded, because nothing says apprenticeship like being blamed for your boss's failed attempt to invent philosopher's stone soup. Still, the allure of secret knowledge drew many eager assistants. Who knows, maybe today's unpaid interns feel a spiritual kinship with their medieval alchemist counterparts. The rat catcher, now. Let's descend into Europe's ongoing battle with rodents. Cities were full of grain, garbage, and disease, which meant rats. So naturally, there was a whole profession of rat catchers, armed with traps, dogs, ferrets, or just a lot of confidence. Rat catchers patrolled towns to thin the rodent population. Some even became semi-famous, traveling from city to city. You've probably heard the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. That was basically a rat catcher with a musical gimmick. It was dangerous work. Rats carried fleas, and fleas carried plague. Many catchers ended up sick themselves, but the job paid, and sometimes they were even employed by city governments. Ironically, while rat catchers tried to stop plagues, their profession is often remembered as a creepy, superstition-filled business. Half exterminator, half wandering charlatan. The fuller of cloth, this next job sounds innocent enough. Fulling cloth. In the ancient and medieval textile industry, wool cloth had to be cleaned and thickened before use. And the best agent for this? Human urine. So fullers spent their days stomping cloth in vats of warm urine to clean and soften it. In ancient Rome, urine was so valuable for laundry that the Emperor Vespasian even taxed public urinals, leading to his famous phrase, pecunia non olet. Money doesn't stink. Fullers weren't glamorous workers. They stank, their workshops stank, and their neighbors probably hated them. But without them, no one got nice woolen tunics. Fashion, apparently, always has a price. The bear leader in the 18th and 19th centuries, young aristocrats often went on the grand tour of Europe as part of their education. But these spoiled young men couldn't be trusted to travel alone. So families hired a bear leader. This was a tutor or chaperone who guided the youth through foreign cities, supervised their spending, and generally tried to stop them from turning into international embarrassments. The nickname, bear leader, came from the idea that managing a teenager with too much money was about as difficult as leading a bear on a chain. The job required patience, diplomacy, and a tolerance for bad behavior. Some bear leaders were respected scholars, others were desperate for employment. Either way, they usually returned home with plenty of stories about their charges getting drunk in Venice or buying terrible statues in Rome. The executioner. Finally, we can't make a list of strange historical jobs without pausing on the executioner. Being the guy who chopped off heads or tightened the noose was not exactly something people volunteered for. In many cases, the job was hereditary, passed down through families who were shunned by society, but relied upon by the state. Executioners often lived on the edge of town, avoided by neighbors, yet were invited back whenever someone needed a beheading. Ironically, executioners sometimes had medical knowledge, since they understood anatomy. Some even doubled as healers or veterinarians. Imagine the awkwardness. One day he's treating your sprained ankle, the next day he's hanging your cousin. It was a grim profession, but also one of strange respect. People feared them, despised them, and yet lined up to watch them work. History is full of contradictions like that. And that's where we'll pause for part 3. We've just added beetles, dog whippers, rat catchers, and executioners to our ever-growing parade of historical odd jobs. A job market that looks less like LinkedIn and more like the cast list of a very strange medieval play. Next time, we'll drift into even more obscure professions, including animal trainers who risk their lives, servants with very oddly specific duties, and maybe a few jobs that were just scams dressed up as careers. Welcome back, still drifting along with us through history's weirdest resumes. At this point, you could almost imagine us building a medieval job board. Sponge stick attendant wanted, must provide own vinegar bucket. Sin eater position available, bread included. Bear leader needed. Patience not optional, but let's keep stacking the pile. Tonight we'll float into more specialized, oddly specific careers that only make sense if you squint at them through the lens of history. The taster of royal urine, yes. Let's start strong. Monarchs and nobles were always anxious about their health. Before lab tests, physicians often examined, and occasionally tasted, urine samples to diagnose problems. The practice was called uroscopy, and doctors swore they could tell everything from digestion to imbalances of the humors, just by swirling a little flask of yellow liquid in the candlelight. Now, here's the catch. When the patient was a royal, they usually didn't want the physician personally handling the samples. So enter attendants and underlings. These unlucky assistants got the task of ferrying urine flasks to doctors, sometimes even doing the preliminary look and taste test themselves. So yes, in certain courts, there were people whose job description was essentially professional urine courier and sampler. If LinkedIn existed back then, I'm guessing they wouldn't list it. The keeper of the royal bees. Beekeeping itself isn't strange. Humans have kept bees for honey for thousands of years. But in some courts, especially in medieval and early modern Europe, there was a very specific office, the royal beekeeper. This wasn't just a farmer with hives. These keepers were expected to tend bees whose honey was reserved for the king's table, his medicines, or even the making of mead for royal banquets. Bees were also wrapped up in symbolism, diligence, order, and sometimes immortality. Napoleon later adopted the bee as one of his emblems, because of course he did. The royal beekeeper had to ensure that the king's bees were healthy, productive, and, ideally, not swarming into the faces of noble guests. Imagine trying to keep a swarm of angry insects under control, while your entire career depends on not ruining a feast. Stressful, but sweet. The lamplighter before electricity, cities were dark, very dark. Street lamps ran on oil, gas, or candles. Someone had to go around every evening lighting them, and every morning extinguishing them. That was the work of the lamplighter. It sounds peaceful. Walking the streets at twilight with a long pole, sparking light in every lantern. In reality, it was repetitive, cold, and sometimes dangerous. They climbed ladders, braved storms, and dealt with lamps that didn't want to stay lit. Still, lamplighters became iconic figures in many cities, keeping the streets usable after sundown. Their disappearance with the arrival of electric light was seen as the end of an era, which, honestly, might have been a relief for the guys who spent their lives chasing stubborn wicks in the rain. The royal food sculptor, ancient and medieval banquets weren't just about eating. They were about showing off, which meant hiring artists to turn food into temporary works of art. Enter the food sculptors. In some courts, entire pigs, birds, or even sugar confections were molded into elaborate shapes. Castles, mythological creatures, or famous battles. The more absurd, the better. One 16th century Italian banquet featured an entire cooked horse stuffed with smaller animals. each stuffed with something else, a kind of culinary Russian nesting doll of questionable taste. Food sculptors didn't necessarily get respect. They were servants, after all. But for a moment, as guests gasped at a roast swan wearing a crown, they were the silent masterminds behind the spectacle. The royal hair collector personal grooming was a big deal for nobles, especially since most of them didn't have much else to do. Hair had symbolic importance, and strands were sometimes saved for love tokens, relics, or even sorcery protection. So yes, some courts employed servants whose job was to collect and store the monarch's fallen hairs after grooming. These were carefully preserved, not just swept away like dust, because you never knew when a stray lock might be needed for a reliquary, or, less pleasantly, stolen for witchcraft. Imagine spending your career following a king around with a little pouch, waiting for a stray hair to land so you could grab it before it hit the ground. Prestige? Maybe not. Job security? Apparently yes. The ale conner of medieval England medieval towns had a problem. How do you make sure the ale at the tavern isn't watered down? The solution was an official called the ale conner. These inspectors tested the quality of ale in public houses. Their methods varied. Some simply sipped it. Others used more colorful techniques. One traditional test was to pour ale on a wooden bench, sit down in leather breeches, and wait. If the ale was sticky enough to glue them to the bench after a while, it was judged strong and proper. If not, the brewer was in trouble. So yes, part of the job description was sitting on beer-soaked furniture for the sake of justice. Strange. But someone had to keep medieval pubs honest. The leper's bell ringer leprosy was one of the most feared diseases of the medieval world. Lepers were forced into isolation, living in colonies away from towns. To avoid accidental contact, they carried bells that they rang whenever they approached, warning healthy people to keep away. Some communities even designated individuals, not necessarily lepers themselves, to ring bells during processions, funerals, or charitable collections for leper houses. Their sound became synonymous with both pity and dread. Not a career anyone wanted to boast about. But in a world obsessed with visible markers of disease and sin, it was considered necessary public service. The court jester. We can't get through a list of strange jobs without the classic jester. They're often remembered as comedians in silly hats, but the role was more complicated. Jesters were licensed fools, allowed to speak truths that would have gotten anyone else executed. They mixed humor with criticism, often poking fun at the king himself. Some were genuinely witty and influential. Others were little more than bumbling entertainers forced to juggle for their supper. The job was precarious. Make the king laugh and you lived comfortably. Make one bad joke and you could end up unemployed, or worse. It was a career balanced on the sharp edge of comedy and danger. And no, they didn't always wear jingling hats with bells. Sometimes they were just sarcastic courtiers with a talent for surviving by making fun of everyone else. Basically the original stand-up comedians, only with higher risks. The cursing specialist? Finally, let's end this part on something properly odd. In many ancient cultures, Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia, people believed you could hire professionals to curse your enemies. These curse specialists inscribed names and wishes for misfortune on lead tablets, buried them in graves, or performed elaborate rituals. Clients ranged from jealous lovers to business competitors. And while we can't measure the success rate, the fact that thousands of curse tablets have been dug up suggests the demand was steady. It's the ancient version of hiring someone to hex your boss, except it was socially accepted, and sometimes even wrapped in religious ritual. And that's the close of part 4. Tonight we've added urine tasters, beer inspectors, lamplighters, and curse writers to our endless resume of odd jobs. History's workforce truly had something for everyone, provided you didn't mind tasting questionable liquids or waving giant feather fans all day. Next time, we'll drift into part 5, where we'll explore even more curious occupations. Animal tamers who risked their necks, professional hermits who lived in gardens, and maybe even a few careers that sound suspiciously like scams with good marketing.